Thank you for joining me today as we talk about creating an AWS Lambda function that reads and writes files from Amazon S3. Our focus in this AWS Cloud tutorial will be on the IAM role, which is attached to the Lambda function. Each IAM role has policies attached to it, and these policies determine the permissions the Lambda function will have. In this cloud example, we will show you how you can use a predefined Amazon managed policy, and then how you can create your own inline policy to give the Lambda function the exact permissions it needs. This is a good practice and is referred to as the principle of least privilege. Okay, let's get started. Let's start with a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this AWS tutorial. The first thing we'll do is introduce you to IAM roles. Next, we'll create an AWS Lambda function that reads and writes files to S3. After that, we're going to add policies to the role associated with the Lambda function. And then next, we're going to cover creating a custom policy. To close out, we'll wrap up with some best practices. So let's go ahead and talk about IAM roles. If you look at the AWS services, if you go to security, identity, and compliance, you'll find IAM as one of the first services listed. Go ahead and click into that. So let's first talk about IAM roles. At this point, you'll be at the IAM homepage, and there's different types of entities under IAM. Users, which are just the individuals, the people that are using the system. Groups, which can be made up of many users. Roles, which are entities that are normally associated with an application or a service, like a Lambda function or EC2 instance, for example. And then there's policies, and policies are actually the permissions that you can associate to a role. You can associate policies to a group or a user. So I just wanted to at least introduce this to you, but we'll come back to this a little later. If you click on roles, you'll see that you can see the roles homepage. And what this will show you is all the roles that have been created, either by you or by other services within AWS. So for example, quite often when we create a Lambda function, there's an option to allow the automatic creation of a role and have that role attached to the function. And so I do that quite often. So you'll see that a lot of the roles here were created by the AWS Lambda service when I was creating a function. Now you could always go in here and create your own roles and attach policies, but this is basically showing you all the roles that have been created in this account. Now we're going to go back over to AWS Lambda and go to the Lambda homepage. And at this point, we're going to want to create a function. Again, you'll see the summary page with all the Lambdas you've created. If you haven't created a Lambda function, this summary will be empty. Go ahead and hit Create Function. Here we're going to want to author from scratch, and you'll want to give your Lambda function a name and select a runtime preference. I normally go with Python 3.8, and then I go ahead and fill that in, use the other defaults that are there, and create function. AWS Lambda service will then create a default Lambda for me with boilerplate code. This is what you see here. If I want to run this, I haven't run this before, so it's going to prompt me to define a test. So I give it a name, hit save, and then I run the Lambda. And you can see here that it returns a success. Everything is fine. What I want to show you next is the role that has been created for this Lambda function. So if you go to the Configuration tab, and then if you click on the role that has been created for this Lambda function, you go to that role's homepage under IAM. Now, this should look somewhat familiar. On the left-hand side, you'll see users, groups, and roles. This is basically the same service that we looked at the beginning of this tutorial. Now we're actually just looking at the specific role that has just been created for this Lambda function. Now you'll see that the policy, we have a default policy attached, which gives us the ability to write to CloudWatch logs. Now, since this Lambda is going to read and write from S3, initially we're going to read from S3, we need to attach a policy to this role, which gives us permissions to do that. So I'm going to go to Attach Policies. and I will put a filter in for S3, and I'll see a policy there that gives us the ability to read from S3. So I'll go ahead and select that and attach it. So now you'll see that this role has a policy that allows it to read from S3. So if we click into that policy, we see some JSON here, which is actually one way that the policy can be represented. And you can see that there's the ability to get, to describe, do other things. The stars in there are kind of wildcards, which allow you to do any action that starts with the word get, for example. But this is effectively what we get by using that Amazon managed policy. So, okay, so let's go ahead and go back to AWS Lambda. But before I do anything here, I'm going to go over to S3 and show you a bucket that I've created. And within that bucket, I've uploaded a file. And this text file, this is what we're going to use to read from our AWS Lambda. The file merely says space is the next frontier. And so it's pretty simple. And so now going back to AWS Lambda, I went ahead and put in the code that I've written to read the file. What you'll see here is that the Lambda handler just basically calls another Python function that sets up all of the necessary references to S3, and then we read the file, we get the contents, return it back, and then the Lambda handler will just print out the contents to the runtime console. So pretty straightforward. Now we run it, and sure enough, it worked. We see in the runtime console, space is the next frontier. This worked. Remember, we'd attached the policy that allowed us to read from S3, so everything was good here. Now, if I were to go back and add another capability to write a file to S3, I can add another function in there to write to S3, and then I can call that from the Lambda handler. And this time, I'm putting in the oceans are not 100% explored. Now this Lambda handler, when we invoke it, will read the file from S3, and then it'll try to write a file to S3. So let's see what happens. And what we see is we get an access denied error. And the reason for this is that our policy that we attached to the role a little bit earlier only gives us permissions to read from S3. It doesn't give us permissions to write to S3. So we have to go back and modify our role and give it the right permission so that we can execute on this. So let's go ahead and go back to the IAM role for this particular Lambda function. And we're going to replace the blanket S3 read policy, this Amazon managed policy that we put in earlier, with a blanket S3 full access policy. So here we have access to read and write and do all types of stuff to all the buckets in S3, right? This is sort of a blanket, very permissive policy. So now the role's been updated. And if we go back and run our Lambda function, we'll see that it works. So we're able to read the file, and we're able to write a file to S3. Now, this does work functionally, but it's not a great production solution in the sense that we've given this Lambda function a lot of permissions, way more than it needs. So we're going to go back to this role, and we're going to remove that blanket full access to S3, and we're going to create an inline policy, which means it's kind of a custom policy. We're not going to use an Amazon managed policy. We're going to create our own custom policy. We go into this inline policy wizard. I want to focus on S3, so I put that into the filter, and I go ahead and select S3. Then I am now prompted to give it very fine-grained permission. So I'm going to go ahead and just get object, and then on the in terms of writing, I'm going to go ahead and just give it put object. And then even better, I'm going to specify that this inline policy only gives the Lambda permissions to read and write from our specific bucket. So there could be many buckets that we have defined, but this inline policy only allows the Lambda to read and write from this specific bucket. And so that's what I'm doing here. We'll get a summary here, and we can go ahead and save the inline policy. And now if you go look at the role, you'll see that we have this sort of custom inline policy, which is very fine-grained to what we need. And so now we go back, run the Lambda function again, which again reads and writes to S3, and you'll see that it's successful. So what we just showed you was this ability to quickly use Amazon AWS managed policies, and those definitely will work, but they're not a best practice. And really, the better practice is to create inline policies for your Lambdas and to effectively give the Lambda just the right permissions it needs to do what it needs to do. So now let's quickly go to S3 and look for the file that was written by the Lambda function. And indeed, we see the second file. We go ahead and click on it and download it to your local machine. And once you have it, you can open it up with an editor. And you'll see that it says the oceans are still 100% unexplored. Again, this was just a simple example showing you reading and writing from S3 and how you can create really fine-grained permissions or policies that you can attach to the role, which is associated with the Lambda function to give you exactly what you need. All right, you can find this example up on GitHub. I'll have a reference to that in the YouTube description. So now some best practices. You should always use the principle of least privilege when assigning permissions to any compute entities. In this case, the policies that are attached to the roles that the Lambda functions are using. Lambda functions should have their own role. You shouldn't really ever have one role being used by multiple Lambda functions. And the reason is that if for some reason one of the Lambda functions needs additional policies to execute, and you update that role, then all the other Lambdas will get that policy even though they don't need it. So every Lambda should have its own role. Thanks for watching. All videos and GitHub related artifacts reference will be in the YouTube description. I definitely encourage you to browse the channel, and if there's other videos of interest, I encourage you to watch. If you like the way I'm packaging this content, please consider subscribing. I would definitely appreciate that. And lastly, we all love AWS Cloud and all the innovation with machine learning and AI, but please don't forget to live in the real world. Get outside, go for a swim, go for a hike, ride your bike, just move your body. And with that, have a good day. Thank you.